Welcome to the GreekNewTestament.io podcast with hosts Dennis, Stephen, and Ian. We bring you in-depth grammatical discussions of the Greek New Testament, from verse analysis to syntactical concepts to textual criticism. Our discussion is all based on our joint project to bring a Greek New Testament grammatical commentary to the church. If you have a love for God's Word and hunger for deeper understanding of the grammar of Koine Greek language, this is the podcast for you.
Hello, viewers and listeners. Welcome to our podcast. This is Ian, and I'm joined by Dennis and Stephen. Dennis, do you want to give us a quick introduction to what we're going to be talking about today?
We're going to be talking about the verse, 1 Corinthians 15:2. It's going to be quite different from the podcast that we did before on Hebrews 7. We're going to be talking this time about semantics.
Okay, great. And I wanted to give a little bit of background on our project, since the project is a little new to our viewers and listeners. But our project is GreekNewTestament.io, and as a way of introducing that project, we've started this podcast. And this podcast is going to be very interactive, talking about verses of the Bible and other syntactical and grammar topics, but all with an eye of showing you some of the capabilities of our project, and that's grammatical commentary of the Greek New Testament. So we're going to keep the discussions very lively and interactive, and though Dennis will be our main speaker and teacher, there will be frequent questions and comments from Stephen and me. And we're going to start this podcast, as we will all our podcasts, with scripture reading from the Greek New Testament. Stephen?
Yes, I would like to read the scripture reading. I will read it from the Greek New Testament. This is from NA 27, and I will be reading it using the modern Greek pronunciation. It's from 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 and 2, just to set the context. And I will read it twice. Here's how it sounds. Γνωρίζω ὑμῖν ἀδελφοί το εὐαγγέλιον εὐηγγελισάμην ὑμῖν, ὅκια παρελάβετε εν ὅκια ἑστήκατε, διούκια σῴζεσθε, τίνι λόγω εὐαγγελισάμην ὑμῖν, εἰκὼ κατέχετε, ἐκτός ὑμῖν εἰκῇ ἐπιστεύσατε. So that's the whole sentence. And let me read it one more time. Follow along as I read. Γνωρίζω ὑμῖν ἀδελφοί το εὐαγγέλιον εὐηγγελισάμην ὑμῖν, όκια παρελάβετε εν όκια ἑστήκατε, διούκια σῴζεσθε, τίνι λόγω εὐηγγελισάμην ὑμῖν, εἰκὼ κατέχετε, ἐκτός ὑμῖν εἰκῇ ἐπιστεύσατε.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Stephen. Dennis, are we ready to begin our interactive discussion today?
Yes, let's go.
All right, let's get started.
Now, I would like to start by focusing on the way that the Greek is formatted on the right-hand side, and then we'll get into a reading of the standard translation. There are some features of the way that it's formatted on the right-hand side, and you will notice that this sentence, which consists of verse 1 and 2, has 8 clauses. And the clauses are headed by a verb, and the verb is underlined. And there's one line per verb, so they're broken so that there are clauses on each line. And there's an indentation, and the indentation indicates subordination. In the level of indentation is the level of subordination. So you'll see a couple of lines at the bottom there that are indented twice. One other conspicuous feature on the presentation is the blue color on tínι λόγω. And that means that we're focusing on that particular phrase, and we're going to discuss the various interpretations of it that we see in translations. Pastor, would you like to read the English there so that we can get an orientation?
I make known to you, brothers, the gospel that I proclaimed to you, that you also received, in which you also stand, by which you also were saved, if you hold firmly to the word that I proclaimed to you, unless you believed in vain.
Now, this would sound familiar to people who read the New Testament because it's the standard translation means it's in a lot of the translations. Up at the top on the left hand side is a grammatical description of this translation. It's a grammatical description from the Greek perspective. Tini λόγω evæγγελισάμην is taken as the dative object of κατέχετε, and then you'll see the word rejected. So we're going to present 4 options, translation options, and we're going to talk about why they're rejected in a minute. But there's one other thing that I would like to discuss, placing this entire discussion in the proper perspective. Normally, we are not challenging theology in this series. It may occur that we will challenge theological interpretations, but usually translations don't get their theology wrong in any kind of major way. The next level that we did, the lowest level that we did in the first podcast is the usual level. That was the syntactical level. What that means is, does the English translation syntax correspond to the Greek syntax? And we focus on that because a lot of students, particularly beginning students, will look at the English to try to figure out what the syntax of the Greek is. And in doing that, they typically make a mistake because the English doesn't target translation of syntax. It targets translation of meaning. That first podcast, that's all we did. But this one, we're going to escalate quite spectacularly, and we're going to challenge the translations in their semantics, not their theology, but in their semantics. So that's fairly rare because usually they don't get the semantics wrong, but in this case, we think they did. The first one was option 1, that's the standard, but this is a historical tour through the translations, and we're going all the way back to the Vulgate and Wycliffe in his translation from the Vulgate. It didn't even come from the Greek. In this translation, here is the wording in English: by which you were saved, which is why I proclaimed the gospel to you, if you keep it, unless you believe in vain. You can see that there's no dative object in this translation. The tini λόγω is translated in quite a different way. It's translated adverbially. If you look up in the top on the left-hand side, you'll see the word adverbial in bold, or you might say parenthetic, as a interrogative relative clause. And the type of adverbial is adverbial of reason or purpose. And the third factor to note is what clause it modifies. In this case, it modifies the save clause, the top clause. Option 4 is the Geneva Bible interpretation, taking tini λόγω as tini λόγω εὐαγγελισάμην as an adverbial interrogative relative clause of manner, modifying κατέχετε. This translation is also impossible. So here's how it goes. By which you also were saved, if you hold firmly the way I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. And we're going to come back to these options and compare them. So let's go to the next slide. This is a historical synopsis of the progress of this verse in translations into English. So ever since the King James Version 1611, most translators have agreed with option one, tίνι λόγῳ, the word, the message, what I preached to you, or what I preached, the word that I preached to you, or what I preached to you, is taken as a dative object of κατέχετε. Now, option one is an unfortunate correction of option 4, which was an unfortunate correction of option 3, which was a misunderstanding of option 2. This is the sequence of developments of getting off track. Option 2, the Vulgate, translated correctly into English by Wycliffe from the Vulgate, tίνι λόγω, in evæγγελισάμην clause. It modified the preceding clause as an adverbial clause of reason, why Paul preached the gospel. So what we're saying is, this is the correct interpretation. It was interpreted and translated correctly by the Vulgate originally, and Wycliffe picked up the correct translation as an adverbial clause of reason. And now we're going to look at the progression of mistakes. So at the time of Erasmus, when Erasmus first edited the Greek New Testament and it became available to Luther in the Reformation, Luther and Tyndale translated Erasmus right away. And they did a change from the way that Wycliffe had translated it. Wycliffe translated the adverbial clause, which is tίνι λόγω εὐαγγελισάμην ὑμῖν. They translated it as Wycliffe translated it as an adverbial clause of reason. That was why Paul preached. But for some reason, Luther and Tyndale didn't like that translation, even though it seems to us to be the most obvious one because λόγω seems like reason. They changed it to a adverbial clause of manner. And there are some reasons within Latin why they did that. In Latin, the translation is qua ratione, which had two different meanings. Quo modo, the manner, or quam ob causam, which is the reason. So they could have either chosen one or the other. It seems like they would have chosen the one that was the reason, but they didn't. And we're not exactly sure why, but it seems like this was a way that qua ratione had become interpreted, and there are various occurrences of qua ratione in the Vulgate, and they usually were interpreted as manner rather than reason. So this is the first step of getting off track. Next, Geneva and the Bishop's Bible perceived some difficulties with the Luther and Tyndale translation. The difficulty was that a clause of manner did not really make sense as modifying the save clause. And the reason for that was they were not saved by the manner in which Paul preached. So what they did was they moved the clause into the following clause where it seemed to belong. This was a semantically correct move, but from a syntactical perspective, it was an impossible move. It was just a simple mistake. The reason that it's a simple mistake is because the following clause is ἡ κατέχετε. ἡ κατέχετε is a conditional clause if you keep on, if you keep it. Well, as we study in the functional grammar, the language patterns, we see that you cannot have an adverbial clause preceding the marker. The marker is the ἡ, and the marker is the start of the conditional clause. Some things can go before the marker, but not an adverbial clause. It's impossible in English, It's impossible in Greek. So this translation doesn't reflect the syntax of the Greek. In this case, it does not even reflect the meaning of the Greek, so it's a mistake. So let's go on to the next slide and see what the next development is.
Hey, Dennis, before we switch there, let me just quick ask. So on this, we see the word order changing in the English and how they translate it, but you're saying that because of the rules we're seeing from your database of other patterns, that this does not happen, where this adverb can jump to this if marker. And so in this case, this changing of the word order is unwarranted. Is that the right way to say it?
It's a violation of the syntax rules in Greek, because the Greeks would not have any way of making the connection that has been made by transposing the clauses in English. You see, this gets back to a discussion that we had in the other podcast about jumping things around and switching up order. English students learn that Greek is more flexible, and Greek can switch the order in ways that English wouldn't. Therefore, this opens up the possibility of a lot of different interpretations if you have latitude to switch the order of phrases. And what the English students and even the translators don't understand sometimes is that the order is flexible, and it is more flexible than the English, but where it does not have the inflectional cues to handle the transpositions and the change of order, then Greek has to fall back on juxtaposition, just like English does. And if you see the clause, tίνι λόγω εὐαγγελισάμην ὑμῖν, there are no inflectional clues for the clause as to the clause that it belongs to. However, inflectional clues are also supplemented by markers. Markers also help determine the order. A marker is a conjunction. In this sentence, the, u, ka, up in the top of the Greek, all three of those are markers. Tini is a marker, and e is a marker, and ἐκτός, ὑμῖν are markers. All of these four Greek clauses start with one or more markers, and the markers come first. They're signals to the Greek hearer that a new phrase is starting, and the type of phrase that the Greek hearer is to expect. And you cannot jumble these markers. They're not inflectional. They're order-driven, just like English is. The English word the has to come before the noun that it modifies, and the Greek word e has to come before its noun too.
If the order were changed, the order in the translation, it would be immediately apparent that it doesn't make a lot of sense. Down in the bottom right, by which you also were saved, the way I preached to you, if you hold firmly, unless you believed in vain. It's very jumbled in English if we follow the Greek word order.
Well, that's a good observation. The Geneva Bible and the Bishop's Bible were reacting to an order problem in the first two Reformation Bibles. And so they were attempting to correct it by transposing the order of this clause, the tίνι λόγω clause, to where it would make more sense. And it did make more sense, but now what you're noting is, even though it made more sense, it still doesn't make total sense. And so actually your comment segues right into what the modern standard, starting with King James, came on to. And that was, we're going to make it into a dative object. So in the modern standard, it does not have any semantic problems. The English doesn't have any semantic problems like you noted in the previous two. They solved their semantic problems. The only problem with the solution that they used is that it's the wrong solution. It's actually an impossible solution. If you see up at the top on option one. We're going back to option one, and we're in the progression. There was a progression of changes that improved the semantics, but made the syntactical part worse, and actually made it impossible. They improved the sound of the semantics, but they didn't actually get it right. So you see the word rejected up there. And so now we're going to go into why this particular solution, which is familiar to most readers, is doubly impossible. The first reason that it's impossible is the same reason as before. It has transposed the order of the clauses, so that the adverbial clause, tίνι λόγῳ εὐαγγελισάμην, is in the following ὑκὼ κατέχετε clause. As we noted before, this is impossible because you can't transpose a clause across the if marker. You can transpose a couple of things across, but not an adverbial clause. Now, the second thing that they did to improve the semantics was that they made it what is called a dative object. Tίνι λόγω is a dative object. In this translation, they made it a dative object of ὑκὼ κατέχετε. Well, this is also impossible. They didn't know it because they didn't have a database, and they didn't have the language patterns. They didn't have computers, and they didn't have all of our resources. But κατέχετε does not govern a dative object the way hold fast to does in English sometimes. So it seemed natural to the translators, and it seemed natural to most of the translators since then, but it isn't natural in Greek. It's actually not a Greek pattern. And this pattern is so well established. Κατέχετε is a part of the echo syntax, part of the simplex family, and the accusative object is what's always taken by this whole syntax family. It doesn't govern a dative object. What they did is they improved the way it sounded, and besides, it was very natural. If you look in the phrase, the blue phrase there, you see the word λόγω, and then εὐαγγελισάμην. Well, that looks like preach the word, doesn't it? Those two words are right together. And this is going to jump out as preach the word. And it seems like the right interpretation, and that's kind of what the modern interpretation gives you. The only problem is λόγω has two completely different uses. Sometimes it's an adverbial abstract use, and sometimes it refers to the word. And εὐαγγελισάμην, just like κατέχετε, does not govern a dative object. So this doesn't work because this is not a word that's being preached. That's not what the Greek would have said to any Greek person. So now we have some more fun. The grammarians have noted numerous problems. A lot of the grammarians, there's a list of some of the ones that have observed objections to the standard translation. The problem with their objections is they have a large variety of solutions. Yes, the grammarians, they wanted to change it. They didn't like the standard translation, and they talk about it, but they don't sound a clear trumpet, so to speak. They're not unambiguous. And so the translators, you might think that they would take the grammarians into consideration, but they didn't, and they didn't for a couple of reasons. There are three reasons why the modern translators abandoned the older interpretation and chose King James and ignore the warnings of the grammarians. This is an unusual circumstance, but they did it, and there were reasons for it. So the first reason is the modern interpretation is very clear and intuitive. It just seemed right. There was a right feel to it. Even though the word λόγω is not instrumental like Robertson attempted to make it, that also supports this interpretation, even though he complained about it, because it's still taking λόγω as the word rather than as the reason. So the grammarians they're complaining about it, but they're not coming through very strong and clear. So let's look at the next reason why the grammarians, they were all over the map. They don't even definitely state the rules that are violated. If the translators tried to follow the hints of the grammarians, then it would start to become unclear. So this conflicting suggestions of the grammarians don't translate into any semantic improvements. So let's look at the third reason why the option 1 is selected anyway. Option 1 also puts eւαγγελισάμην, the clause, in the κατέχετε clause and violates the same prohibition as option 4 and is thus inconsistent, but the modern translators have done a thing that they're not supposed to do. They've put semantics before grammar in this verse. They've gone with their theological imagination and the King James dynamic equivalent. And here's a case in point that shows how the commentators, the grammatical commentators, have gone awry. It's from Thistleton's 1 Corinthians in the New International Greek Testament Commentary. Thistleton says, he endorses the dative translation, even though he notes that the grammarians complain about it. But he comes out with the statement, I didn't quote the statement, but the statement is just verbiage. It's an excuse. It has nothing, the statement has no grammatical part in it. So he's abandoned the warnings to take grammar seriously, to take the Greek grammar seriously, which is what our grammatical commentary is trying to do. Why did the earlier vernacular translators reject the correct option 2? We touched on this before, but I'll go into it in a little bit more. It might be a fluke of Latin evolution. Jerome used the phrase qua ratione to translate tini λόγω in 1 Corinthians. And apparently the Latin expression later became ossified into just an adverbial phrase of manner. So we know that what the correct translation of tini λόγω is into Latin, because in Acts 10:29, this characteristic and unique phrase occurs exactly, and Jerome translates it as quam ab causam, which is an adverbial of reason. It appears that tini λόγω was a close synonym for the œν etian, for which reason? We see this in a number of verses. In other words, there were two ways to express the same thing in Greek and two ways to express the same thing in Latin. Both of the two ways meant for which reason. We know that because Jerome also translated all these verses with quam ob causam. Probably if Jerome had translated tini λόγω as in 1 Corinthians 15:1 as quam ob causam, the way he did in Acts 10:29, the older translations would have selected option 2 instead of option 3, and this whole sequence of errors never would have occurred. But those are the flukes of the choices of translators. Now we're going to back up. We're going to regroup, and we're going to look at, instead of translations and comparing them and looking at the earlier versions and trying to improve them, we're going to look at how we would start from scratch if we were translators. Looking at the Greek and having tools to assess the Greek and what the meaning of Greek phrases is. Here is a statement, and we'll see if you agree. It's generally agreed that the proper way to start a translation is with Greek vocabulary and syntax and grammar objects, not by looking around at other translations. It's generally agreed, but it's not always done that way. So the first step in a functional grammar, which our grammatical commentary is a functional grammar, when diagramming the syntax of the verse is, number 1, to isolate special phrases like tini λόγω and identify them grammatically. These are the signature key phrases that help us get a continuity throughout the whole Bible. The second part of this first step is to find out how such phrases are used and what their precedents are. By precedents, we mean examples of the same construction occurring in other verses. So we're going to focus on what tis is. We're starting with our start over. Tis is called an interrogative pronoun used as an attributive to modify the dative noun. This is possibly kind of thick grammatical construction, but if we were doctors, we would use that thick kind of anatomical language because it conveys precisely as opposed to the sloppy way that a lot of grammars are written. The advantage of speaking precisely with precise words is they have a defined meaning that you can look up and they don't slip around. So tini is concordant with its head in case, number, and gender. That's how we know that tini is the modifier of logo. Now, there are only two possible uses for an interrogative pronoun, like tis or pios, which or what kind of. The first use is in a main interrogative clause. It's just a simple question, what is the purpose? Or in an interrogative relative clause, which we see in the regular translation, done by Wycliffe and Jerome. So let's go on. Now that we've described the two grammatical components, we're going to look more closely at the precedent and how the precedent works. The precedent is Acts 10:29. The phrase here is, "So I ask, for what reason have you sent me?" It can also be translated another way. "So I ask, for what reason you have sent for me." That shows the two uses of the interrogative pronoun, the tini. If we look here at the bottom on the left-hand side, it says the Alexandrian editors capitalized tini, making it a main interrogative clause in direct discourse. But the Byzantine editors don't capitalize tini. They make it an interrogative relative clause in indirect discourse. Those are two ways of describing the same thing, and you can see that we have the same two ways of direct or indirect discourse in English, and the wording is the same, except that we transpose the word in the two descriptions. So although these are technical, they have the parallel in English, so they're not as challenging as some things. The other first step, we're starting over. We're analyzing how to solve this problem of identifying the correct semantic option of the four. Find the head of each word with its grammatical relation. This is what we do as in functional grammar syntax. We find the head of each word. So we look at the dative noun logo. It must be the head of the attributive interrogative pronoun tini because of concordance. And then we look at eўαγγελισάμην. It must be the head of the logo clause because interrogative tini is a marker that always precedes its relative interrogative clause head without any verb intervening, and isolation from the following clause E. So what does that mean? That tini is a marker that starts, it's an interrogative marker in an interrogative relative clause that starts the clause, and that the verb always follows it. Therefore, we know if you look over on the right-hand side at the blue tini logo, we know by precedent as a rule of grammar that the tini is always in the eўαγγελισάμην clause because it's a fixed rule of order. Tini is an order marker, and it always comes first before its clause, and it can't belong to the κατέχετε clause. So that's why we know that, and why else we know that is because of the other marker, ἡ, which is in the ἡ κατέχετε. That is a break point that breaks off the κατέχετε clause, and the tίνι λόγω cannot go into that clause because it's in front of the marker. These are rules of grammar that you'll learn the importance of markers in deciphering the syntax of the Greek New Testament. Tίνι λόγω εὐαγγελισάμην is an interrogative relative clause. So we're identifying that. And the next question in syntax, which is ordering the words hierarchically, is what is the head of the εὐαγγελισάμην clause? We saw that in the standard phraseology, the standard option, the head was made to be κατέχετε. Option 1 attempts to make κατέχετε the head of εὐαγγελισάμην. However, we saw that was impossible. Κατέχετε doesn't take a dative object because it's accusative transitive. And tίνι λόγω cannot be the indirect object of either of these. It's semantically impossible. We're not talking to the word. So tίνι λόγω, therefore, by deduction, must be adverbial. Unlike the standard option in which it's a dative object, it has to be adverbial like the older translations, because there are only three options in grammar for a dative noun, λόγω. What are the three options? They're direct object, dative object, and adverbial. And we've eliminated the indirect object and the dative object. So by fall-through logic, it's got to be adverbial. And we've located the clause that it has to be in the εὐαγγελισάμην clause, because of the markers. So we've also seen how adverbial κατέχετε after if cannot be the head of the εὐαγγελισάμην clause before the if. So now we've done our due diligence as far as sorting out the head and dependent relations of the words in the sentence. So the natural head for εὐαγγελισάμην clause is the preceding adjacent, σῴζεσθε, and it's quite regular. We have a deviation. Some grammarians attempt to go all the way back up to the beginning, to the remote Γνωρίζω, to make that the head, but that's never done in good grammar, because this is back to the skipping over problem. You can't skip over a whole bunch of prime candidates and then go back to some remote candidate. There's no precedence for it, and it would be confusing. You can skip over stuff if you have the inflectional signals to skip over, but these are clauses and they don't have the inflectional signals, and the readers wouldn't know how to make out this kind of meaning. So these are examples of grammarians using their imagination and carrying the flexibility of Greek too far. So we're going to the conclusion now. We're just reviewing them. Option 1 is impossible because it provides no explanation for why tínι λόγω is dative. Remember that one of the very first requirements for any syntactical grammarian is to explain the case of every word that's inflectional, that every word that's that has a case, because none of these verbs take a dative object. So every case needs a grammatical function. So unbelievably, the option 1, even though it's very popular, totally ignores the only other example of tínι λόγω that shows what it means. So normally our critiques of the verses are kind of gentle. They don't dispute semantics or particularly theology. But in this case, we're being a little bit rougher and we're saying, well, they really all got the semantics wrong. and they missed the big clue. So they haven't gone to the basics, and we like to go back to the basics. Option 4 was the next one, and that's impossible because it moves the adverbial clause, evæγγελισάμην, across the following if marker. It's a no-no. It's a total violation. It's an absolute rule. There are no exceptions. Option 3 was their next progress. The problem with it was that it was, as Pastor noted, awkward and confusing, since the adverbial of manner is semantically more suited to modify the κατέχετε clause, but it can't do that. So let's finish with the conclusion. The only option, option 2, has no drawbacks and adheres to the precedents. Why would Paul add that clause since parenthetical clauses are optional? So it wasn't a necessary clause that Paul put in there that we're disputing. He is just driving home the point that the preaching of the gospel was for their salvation. That's why I preached it to you. He's just driving it home. That's why he's putting in this parenthetical adverbial clause. If that had not been his purpose and God's purpose, the gospel never would have come to them in the first place. The gospel and the need to keep it is critical. So Paul had a good reason for putting this in him. Paul is fairly sparing in his terminology, even though he talks quite a bit. Pretty much every word counts. Even if it isn't a theological reason, it's a semantic reason. So there's one other possible point to clear up, and that is our whole presentation in some ways seems improbable. Is it plausible that 500 years of translators would keep on missing the correct option 2 in Wycliffe, which is finally reintroduced by Grammatical Commentary? Well, it has to be admitted that the odds are against it. But ironically, reason is merely a natural translation corresponding to the Vulgate that has been neglected. We cannot explain why 500 years of translators have neglected the obvious. The advantage of a functional grammar with the database language pattern is that it provides new tools for more objectivity that Greek New Testament grammarians have not had before in a systematic way. It's not really that theological correction, but we do want to read the communication of Paul as accurately as we can. So are you going to read these conclusions, Ian, or how are we going to proceed?
Yeah, I can read those. And I think how you just ended it was very fitting, Dennis, because a couple times in the presentation, you mentioned the fact that the translators did not have this database of language patterns. And a big part of our project is, of course, this database of language patterns that we can then look at where else does the pattern occur and is there a precedent for this pattern. And I think that's an important point to make, that with the power of software and big data and the computer, we can now look for these patterns. And of course, you've done a lot of work to code those patterns into this database. But now that they're there, some of the fruit of that is that we can then look at verses like 1 Corinthians 15:2 and even challenge 500 years of translation, even though, as you said in the beginning, that's not our object at all. But it does make for an interesting podcast. So just in conclusion, show today is that a functional grammar like our project, the Greek New Testament Grammatical Commentary, does syntax with objective definitions and statistical tests. So because we have that database, we have occurrences, we can actually look at it statistically and say, does that pattern occur at all? Or how many times or how frequently? And secondly, in conclusion, the standard translation of hold fast to the word priest is wrong, because kateko does not take a dative object. So I think that maybe if we go to the next slide there, Stephen, I think we'll wrap it up with just thanks for viewing this today. Feel free to comment on our YouTube channel or on our website under blog, and our website is greeknewtestament.io. And we thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for listening to the GreekNewTestament.io podcast at www.greeknewtestament.io.